Our speaker tonight is Karl Rhodes. Karl has been here before when he told us about his great-great-grandmother, Peggy, of Peggy's war fame. Karl and his wife, Kim, live in Richmond. He was born in Rockingham County, however, but they do live in Richmond, and he's a retired. We all know what retired means. Doesn't mean really retired. And he worked as a journalist, as editor of the Virginia Business Magazine, and he's been a writer, editor, and researcher for the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. His roots run deep in Rockingham County, and tonight he's going to tell us about his ancestor, his great-great-grandfather, about stories that he heard all his life about this great-great-grandfather hiding rifles in a cave during the Civil War. Karl? Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you to the Historical Society for inviting me, and thank you all for coming. This is a great turnout, especially since I've been here before. You always kind of wonder, will people come back or not? So how many people were here for the first presentation? Oh, wow. So about a third. Okay. Well, I'm going to try not to be too repetitive from that one, but for everybody else that wasn't here for the first presentation, as Barbara mentioned, my great-great-grandmother, Peggy Rhodes, and this is a model portraying Peggy Rhodes. It's not an actual photograph, but we did attempt to have a model that looked as much like Peggy's daughter, her oldest daughter, as we could. We had a good photograph of the older daughter at that age, at the proper age for when the book occurs. So that's my great-great-grandmother, and she did run a depot on the Underground Railroad. And when I say that, people automatically think fugitive slaves. This Underground Railroad occasionally assisted fugitive slaves, but more often, almost always, assisted Dunkers and Mennonites who refused to fight in the war. So they were, in some cases, deserters and draft dodgers, and this was a dangerous thing to do, to hide these young men in a secret cellar under her bedroom floor. There was a trap door there, and she would put a rag rug over top of that so that no one would be the wiser. Does everyone know what a rag rug is? Okay, good. I grew up with rag rugs. So Peggy was very courageous. She was true to her faith, and she also was a postmaster. In her own words, she says postmaster. She never said postmistress, but postmaster on the Underground Railroad. And what this meant was that she would deliver mail to the families of the refugees and then pick up mail from the families and take it back and give it to the guides that would go through the mountains with the next group, so that there was some communication going back and forth. And this was particularly dangerous, to be sending any kind of messages across enemy lines. And she was never caught, but she was doing all of this while her husband, Henry, my great-great-grandfather, was dying of tuberculosis. Back then they would have said consumption. And they had 5 children, 10 and under, to raise, and so the burden of that fell almost entirely on her. And then they had a 120-acre farm to run. So Peggy was very busy. I'm not sure how she slept at all, especially with 5 or 6 young men hiding under her bedroom floor on any given night. But she did make it through, and I'm here to tell the story. So that is the gist of Peggy's story. And the last time I was here, we really focused on Peggy. It was her birthday last time, and tomorrow is her birthday. She'll be 195. Henry will be 200 in May, her husband. So tonight, I want to take a little time to talk about how I got interested in this and what led me to write this book. And to do that, we really have to go back to my great-great-grandfather on a different side of the family, Peter Hartman. And there was a family legend that I had heard from as long as I can remember, that Peter said that he hid guns in a cave on the hill behind Weavers Mennonite Church. And this is what we grew up with, and I certainly believed that legend, and this is a picture of Peter Hartman. And there's a picture of Weavers Church. We lived right down the street from Weavers Church. So our house was maybe 4 doors down from the church, and the hill behind the church was right behind our house. So we thought, of course, that is where those Civil War guns are located. And we spent quite a bit of time looking for them. This map is an 1866 map. I've altered it slightly to put H. Rhoads on there. Jedediah Hotchkiss did this map, and he would not have put H. Rhoads. Also, I added heat wool on this map, and for reasons that we'll talk about afterwards, Jedediah Hotchkiss took all the heat wools off of his maps after the war. And that may come up in the questions. Weavers Church, we highlighted there, was on one side of where I lived, which was the red dot, and Peggy's house was on the other side. We didn't know where Peggy lived. We didn't know anything about this story at all growing up. All we knew was we had heard this legend of guns in a cave. And I wanted to find those guns more than anyone. This is me. You can tell by that I'm ready for almost anything. My big brothers rough me up from time to time, so that's why my face is a little scuffy. But I had a BB gun to fend them off with. And the hill behind me is the hill where we would search for the guns in the cave. And one day when I was 4 years old, this is when I was 4 years. This picture is when I was 4 years old. But one day when I was 4, my brothers came to me and said, "We think we found the cave where the guns are hidden." And I knew exactly what they were talking about, and they wanted me to go with them. So I did. We went up through the pasture, across some fences with some barbed wire, and made it all the way to the top of the hill, and there was a little hole about, I would say, 2.5 feet high and maybe 3 feet wide, that went down at an angle of about 30 degrees, and it went down about 15 feet. And then you would come to this place where you could not get past. So my brothers thought, let's get Karl. He's the youngest, he's the smallest. Maybe he can squeeze through that little pinch point. And so I tried. I went down the hole and with the flashlight, and I got to that point, and something inside me just said, no, don't do this. The pinch point was about the size of my head. And briefly, I thought maybe I could stick my head through and see the guns on the other side. But I decided not to do it. And as far as I know, we never went back to that little cave again. But I always did, for years, I wondered if those guns were somewhere just beyond that pinch point, and I wanted to squeeze through there so badly. Well, as I got older, I realized a couple of things. One, Weavers Church, at the time of the Civil War, was on the north side of US Route 30, and we were looking on the south side where the current Weavers Church is located. So we were looking on the wrong hill. But even then, I started to kind of doubt the whole thing. Why would a teenage boy take guns presumably from Confederate soldiers and hide them in a cave? It made almost no sense at all. And so I kind of had some doubts. I did ask my grandmother on the Rhodes side of the family if she thought this legend was true. And she said, yes, I do think it's true. Peter Hartman always said that. So she had actually heard this from Peter Hartman. But by that time, as I got older, I was really more interested in genealogy. So how many people here have done some genealogy with their families? Quite a few, almost more than half. And Peggy's husband was quite a mystery. He died young, and he had 2 tombstones. And that intrigued me. You know, why does Henry have 2 tombstones? And I just couldn't find much information on Henry. So one day, I'm not sure why, I thought, you know, I'm going to search for Margaret Rhodes, Henry's wife. In genealogy, quite often, at least back in those days, that didn't yield very much because men tended to sign all the legal documents. Most of the history was written about men, not women. And if I couldn't find anything on Henry, certainly I won't find anything on Margaret, or Peggy, as she was called. But I was wrong. I came across one reference on the internet, and to be fair, this is the first time I really searched on the internet for Peggy. Earlier on, when I was trying to do genealogy, we didn't have the internet, so we were just looking at books and at archives. And sure enough, there was a reference to Peggy, and I went and found that book. Matter of fact, Pete Burkholder is with us tonight. He was the one that I called and said, do you know anything about this? Pete grew up on Peggy's farm. And he said, yeah, I've got a copy of that book. And I said, well, I'll be right there. We live in Richmond, and Pete lives in the Harrisonburg area. So the very next day, I showed up at Pete's coffee shop, and he loaned me the book. And I'm eventually going to give it back to him any day now. But in there, I remember asking Pete, is this just a couple of pages of legal mumbo-jumbo that's not going to amount to much? And he said, oh no. He said, there's 27 pages of verbatim testimony from Peggy and her neighbors and her relatives and so on about their experiences during the Civil War. And this truly was the most important source for my book, Peggy's War. It is 6 volumes and 5,000 pages. There's a lot to it. And I did read it twice, and actually more than twice now. And my idea was I need to boil this down to a readable story that is a cohesive story about the Underground Railroad and Mennonites and the Dunkers and the war. And so I did. The Underground Railroad, just as a quick, for those of you who weren't here last time, the Underground Railroad generally started in the valley, Harrisonburg, Rockingham, Augusta, not so much Shenandoah County. It was more where the Mennonites and Brethren were located. And there weren't as many Mennonites at the time in Shenandoah County. And they would go north through the mountains, usually through Hopkins Gap or possibly Dry River Gap. They used several of the gaps. And then back across the mountains to Petersburg or maybe Moorfield. And then from there, they would go on north to west, New Creek. And New Creek was important because that's where they could catch the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and then go into Pennsylvania or into Ohio where there were family members. And it was much easier to stay out of the war for a young man in the north than it was in the south. The north had a lot more people than the south did. And so the north was not quite as desperate for manpower to fight the war. And I put Edinburgh on there just to give us a point of reference because this map is kind of hard to read. Edinburgh, so this is going on directly to our west. And this is not the only route of the Underground Railroad, but it's one of the more well-traveled. And this is what Peggy actually said in her testimony about aiding 5 or 6 men together at a time. And they would stay several days. One of them stayed almost a year in her house. So if you can imagine having house guests, some of which stay a year, what that would be like while your husband is dying. But that sums up, I think, the Underground Railroad quite well. The other thing I found that intrigued me in this Unionist and the Civil War experience were comments like these. Did he have his gun with him? No, sir. If he had been caught with that, he would have been taken for a bushwhacker. And what he means by taken is mistaken. He would have been mistaken as a bushwhacker. A bushwhacker is someone who's not in uniform. It's a guerrilla-style warfare where they would shoot at armies as they passed by. And both North and South had bushwhackers that were usually part of the local population. And you did not want to be mistaken for a bushwhacker, especially in the Shenandoah Valley. We have a very famous case, Davy Getz. How many people know the story of Davy Getz? A few. Just very briefly, Davy Getz was mistaken for a bushwhacker near Woodstock. He was a mentally challenged 30-couple-year-old man who was out hunting with his squirrel gun and was marched all the way to Dayton, which is south of Harrisonburg, a distance of at least 50 miles, and then given a silly trial and then forced to dig his own grave and was killed. This was by order of Custer, George Armstrong Custer. So to this day, George Armstrong Custer is not well liked in the Shenandoah Valley, and this is just one of the reasons why. But I think the Davy Getz story was put it in people's minds that you do not want to be mistaken for a bushwhacker. So now all of a sudden, the story about the guns is starting to make sense to me. And more recently, I found another reason why these Mennonites were hiding guns. There was a point in the war, March 1862, for the next couple of years, where Mennonites and other peace churches could get an exemption. You'd pay a fine and a property tax, and you could be exempt from the war. One of the things that's never mentioned in any of the history books that I just found recently was you also had to turn your weapons over to the state militia or your local militia for use. I believe that the actual law says for public use. In other words, to fight the war. So you might be exempt from the war, but your guns are not exempt from the war. So my theory is that the Mennonites, especially the Mennonites, would have turned in a token number of guns and probably hid the rest. And I think that's where the story comes from about hiding the guns in the cave. So I did, after writing Peggy's War, I started doing presentations like this one. This is a picture of one I did at the Library of Virginia in Richmond. And at the very first presentation that I did, a man came up to me. He waited till after everyone had come through and left, and he said, "I think I know where you can find your cave." He had already read the book. And so I got very excited. This was a very credible source that I still don't name because we don't want to give away the actual location of the cave. But he was quite credible, and so on his word, we started digging. And this was a piece of property that belonged to a friend of his, and it clearly had been filled in. There was a hole there. in this rock formation that had been filled up with rocks. And so we started to remove the rocks. My cousin and I did a lot of the work, and I'm thinking he might be here. Yep, in the back is my cousin, Terry Kaiser. Terry is the guy in the kind of green shirt there, helping. What Terry would do quite often is, and Mr. Shaw, what was his first name? Greg Shaw there on the right is clearly providing a lot of the muscle, and I'm providing some of the muscle. And Terry is giving us advice there in the middle. But Terry knows how to excavate things, and we don't. So he did more to find this cave than I did. And we went down quite a bit in that location. Some days, that's me on the left with a sledgehammer busting up rocks that we couldn't pull up out of there. And then on the right, that is that particular excavation site, about 9 feet down. We felt pretty good about this. We were making good progress, and then I made a little bit of a mistake. I was getting overconfident, and I did a newspaper interview with the Daily News Record. And man came down the hill where we were excavating, and he said, I have good news. He said, the property owner read the story about you, and he liked it, and he went out and bought your book, and he liked it. And he said, well, what's the bad news? He said, well, he said you're going to have to stop digging. So we no longer had permission to dig on that site. But there were other tipsters, other people that came forward and said, I think I know where your cave is. And some of those were credible as well. We did a second excavation site that we're not going to talk about too much today, that I think is still promising, but is too difficult to excavate. And then there was a third tip that came in from the man there in the hat, Sam Bowman. I don't know if any of you know Sammy Bowman. But he came forward and said, I know where your cave is. He said, when I was a kid, I used to look down in that hole, and I used to think, I'm going to get a rope ladder, and I'm going to go down that hole and explore that cave. And it's a good thing he didn't, because he wouldn't be around, I don't think he would have made it up out of there. But that's Sam, and that is a impromptu photograph taken on the day we were looking for that, we were exploring that site. Someone took that picture, and Sam had insisted that we needed to look under that rock. And he's remembering things from his early childhood. This is 45, 50 years ago, out in the field that's been regraded, and that cave entrance has been plugged up, filled in. And he's looking around and saying, it's right here. And one thing kind of led to another. It was not exactly under that rock, but it was within about 5 feet. And we started to excavate there. We can see the rock's been removed. We followed some rusty fencing wire that was under the rock. The idea is, well, why is fencing wire under a rock that weighs a ton, literally a ton? And we followed it one direction. That didn't work out too well. We followed it another direction, and we came to this hole right here. And I'm really sad to say that my cousin Terry, there in the back, said at that point, I have to go pick up my kids. And this is about, on the left, this is about where we were when Terry had to leave. The spelunkers that were there that day, it was actually a coincidence that we had spelunkers there. We had never had spelunkers with us before. We thought maybe they would be able to help us find the entrance to the cave. Then maybe they would have, but the first place we tried ended up working. And the spelunkers were helping us dig that out. And as you can see, it became a bigger and bigger hole. And then one of the spelunkers put his helmet on. This is Alex Malone. And did Alex make it tonight? I don't think Alex is here. He lives in Pennsylvania. Alex put his helmet on and said, I'm going to go down the hole. And he did a smart thing before he went down the hole. He took his cell phone and he took a picture of what's down there to see what he's getting into. And the picture he took is on the right. So that is what his cell phone showed on that day. And you're looking 20 feet straight down. So if Sam Bowman, when he was a child, had gotten a rope ladder and gone down there, I don't think he would have ever made it back up. But this spelunker and one other spelunker, they go in pairs, decided to go on down. And the first entrance room that they came to is large enough for about 3 or 4 men to stand up shoulder to shoulder. This is plenty big enough to hide a lot of guns. We did not find any guns in this cave, but we didn't expect to. People after the war would have retrieved these guns. They would not have left them there. But certainly this cave is in the right place. It fits the description, it fits the legend, and it's certainly big enough to hide some guns. From this first landing, this first room, we found some artifacts. You've heard of carbon dating. This is Dr. Pepper dating. This helped quite a bit. There was no date on the bottle or on the cap that was readable, but the logo, Dr. Pepper, if you look right there in the middle, matches the logo on the cap. So we know that this cave was open in the 1970s and possibly up into the 1980s. So that was one of the artifacts we found early on. The spelunkers went a little farther down. The cave kind of twists down as it goes, and it opens up into a larger room where maybe 5 or 6 men could hide. And then on the right, it goes down another 20 feet. And then it goes down, twists a different direction, goes down another 20 feet. So about 60 feet total depth on the cave. And you got to remember, these 2 spelunkers are down in the cave, and we're not hearing anything from them. You can't use your cell phone. You can take a picture down there, but you can't talk to anybody. So we're just waiting, and we waited about a half an hour. And we're thinking, well, did they get hurt? Did they... what has happened? The spelunkers made a big point of telling us before they went down. They said, we go down a lot of holes, and 4 out of 5 times it's not a cave. It's just a cavity between some rocks, and it could be a hiding place for guns, but it's not a cave. So finally, after a half an hour, we're shouting down in there, and we said, is it a cave? And we heard this little voice coming back, say, it's a cave. So the other spelunker, by the way, is Aiden Ward, looking up through from almost on the bottom. As they got farther down, they found initials carved into the rock. This is near the bottom, so almost 60 feet down, we have some initials. And on the left, you maybe can read GM times or plus W something maybe. And if you're having a hard time seeing that, I enhanced it to look like that. And there may be something beside that W. I can't tell if it's an E or an I or something else there, but certainly GM plus or times W. And Alex on the right there is pointing to where the initials are carved. I don't think you can really see the G there that he's pointing to, but that is the spot. And then they went a little farther down and hit rock bottom. So rock bottom has some bones. We didn't see bones anywhere else, but some animal remains on the bottom. And we set some gloves there, or the spelunkers set some gloves there, just to give you a perspective, so you could see that these are fairly small bones. And we found some other things as well. But everything that we found and brought up from the cave tells us a little something. And this little skull there is definitely telling us something. Does anybody know what kind of animal that is? Deer? Too small for a deer. Raccoon. That is a raccoon skull. And this raccoon is telling me, in particular, that it's a lot easier to go down in this cave than it is to come up from the bottom. So I appreciated that advice. We did find a buckle. It's too small, I think, to be a belt buckle. It's very old. It may be Civil War era. It's more likely from a bridle, or someone today suggested a cartridge case, which is a little more intriguing than a bridle. Were you the one that suggested that? No? Okay. So we did find things that were very old and as new as a Dr. Pepper cap. Now, getting back to the raccoon, the spelunkers did come back on another day. They mapped the cave. They gave it a name. We called it Sam's Twist, mostly after the guy who found it, but also the property owner. I'll go ahead and say the property owner's first name is Sam. So the cave is called Sam's Twist. It is big enough to be registered as a cave on cave maps of Rockingham County. And yeah.
Is there a date on the quarter?
Oh, I'm sorry. The quarter is just there for perspective as well. That's a 1974 quarter.
Gotcha, thank you.
Yeah, I haven't spent it yet, but it's been in my pocket for, what is that, 40, 50 years?
That was your first quarter, huh?
It's my first quarter.
All right.
So the spelunkers did come back, and they brought with them a steel cable ladder. And they don't need that ladder. The spelunkers just free climb up and down through that with no problem whatsoever. As a matter of fact, the ladder, they said, made it harder for them to get up and down. But the reason why they brought the ladder was I was going to try to go down in the cave.
Even after they've been down?
After they've been down, yeah. So I tried. Terry was there for this, I believe. And I was pretty much stuck. The thing about climbing a ladder is that you have to have room to bend your knees to raise your feet up or down to the next rung. So I'm in a spot there where I can't go up and I can't go down. My legs are too big for that. So I am going to lose 50 pounds. And I am going to go down in that cave because I promised in Peggy's War, in the introduction, if you've read it, it says, if we find this cave, I'll squeeze through this time. And so I will. So with that, if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I'm no cave expert. I was really hoping some of the spelunkers would be here tonight, but they mostly live in Pennsylvania. They didn't really feel they could make it this far for an evening program. But if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer some of them. Yes, ma'am.
So the cave will stay open. I assume it'll be fenced off.
The question is, will this cave stay open? The answer is we're working with the property owner to put a very secure gate on that cave. So it'll be steel and concrete, and it will be lockable. But it will still be accessible to spelunkers that are qualified to go down to it. There are some really tight spots in that cave. If you want to go all the way to the bottom, it's very tight. It opens up, in between, but very tight at the top. More questions? Yes, ma'am.
Are you sure that's the right cave?
That's a really good question. I personally think that all of these sites that we excavated are probably connected at a level that allows water to pass from one to the other. I don't know if necessarily people can pass from one to another. One thing I left out was that in 1901, there was a newspaper story in the Rockingham Register of schoolboys and their principal at the Weavers Church School finding 2 caves on this hill, 2 caves. And I suspect they're part of the same system. So there are still some caves to be discovered on this hill. And this might not be the one, but it does match the location, the description, not just in the family legend, but also in these newspaper stories. It matches one of the caves mentioned in one of the stories. But there's at least 2. And we think it's probably 3. So that's a great question. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Karl. You probably would have written about this if you come across this information, but your great-great-grandfather, I mean, often some stories like that, they say the proverbial kernel of truth.
Yes.
Is there any ancillary information about handling of rifles, or are there neighbors who have similar stories?
There are neighbors that have stories of men hiding in these caves, but the family legend that came down through my side of the family is the only one that I've heard that mentions hiding guns in caves. It makes sense to me now, but the other legends were more about the deserters hiding in caves. And some of them are mentioned in the same general area. So yes, my oldest brother read this in a book that was at my grandmother's house. And then, as I mentioned earlier, my grandmother pretty much said, yes, that's what Peter Hartman always said, and she overlapped with Peter Hartman quite a bit. He actually lectured about the Civil War at Eastern Mennonite College at the time, or Eastern Mennonite School at the time, yes. We've looked and looked and looked for that book, and we cannot find that book. I was talking about this to an old order farmer in that area who piped up and said, I know something about this. He said, I have read that book. And we've questioned him. We've gone down a lot of blind alleys trying to find where that book came from. Did he borrow it from a neighbor or relative? Or we can't track it down. But I think we will someday. I think if you do enough presentations like this one, someone will come forward and say, I know where that book is. I know. Peter Hartman did have another book, but it's not in there. So yeah, it's just that legend, really. Anything else? Yes, sir.
I do quite a bit of relic hunting and have a number of people that I'm connected with. And here, not too far from this location, on the backside of the mountain for redbacks, there's a similar story upon guns being found in a cave. Now, it's on private property.
Wow.
Nobody supposed to go to that area. But here close to Edinburgh, there is a story of guns in a cave. But
Wow.
I had never thought about the Mennonite or the church connection of people hiding guns.
Yes, so the comment, and the reason I repeat some of these is people that are watching and listening at home don't always hear the comments. Is that correct? So the comment is that there is a cave not far from here where people have said that guns were actually found. Were they Civil War era guns? And they were apparently Civil War era guns. So I would really like to know more about that. More than likely, that's not Mennonites and Dunkers doing that in the Edinburgh area, is my guess, because there really weren't that many Mennonites and Dunkers in the Edinburgh area. So there may have been some other reason for hiding guns. We need to talk.
That's about all I know about that.
Well, let's track it down. Terry? Okay. Terry's in. Other questions?
Are you going to keep looking and looking for caves?
The question is, will we keep looking now? And Terry is shaking his head in the affirmative. So yes, I do want to return to particularly that first location where we were digging. I think it's very promising. The spelunkers that day, we took them to all 3 locations, and they really liked that one.
Do you mean the one where you were no longer given permission?
Correct. So what we're hoping is that we can get this third location squared away in such a way that the property will see what we've done and be okay with it, and maybe extend the invitation again. It's more complicated than what I'm saying because I don't want to reveal too much about where the caves are, but it is more complicated than that, but that's the gist of it. Yes. No one wants to ask about why Henry has 2 tombstones? The theory is, and Henry had no tombstone for a while, and then his grandchildren replaced the tombstone with the one that you saw in the presentation. The old tombstone was found in 1984 at 10th Legion, kind of halfway buried in the mud. There was a story about it in the newspaper. And they figured out who Henry Rhoads was, and they returned it to the proper graveyard, leaned it up against the new tombstone, so now he has an old one and a new one. The old one is in, no longer, but back then in 1980s, it was in pristine condition, which tells me it was laying face down in the mud for a long, long time. My theory is we know that Sheridan's men in the valley used tombstones, particularly long, flat tombstones like that one, as camp tables when they were here for a couple of weeks burning everything. And my theory is that they took that with them and then realized as they were departing the valley that it was too heavy. And they just cast it aside at 10th Legion, and it probably laid in the mud and buried itself and was there for 120 some years. So that's why I think Henry had two tombstones. One of them clearly was stolen by someone. I think the most logical suspect is some of Sheridan's soldiers used it. Yes, sir.
The other question I did not catch, what did Jedediah Hotchkiss take off of the maps? What was that about?
Yes. The question is, what was the story about Jedediah Hotchkiss taking heat wolves in particular off of maps? You hear people say, I'm going to wipe you off the map. That's what Jedediah Hotchkiss did after the war. If you look at his maps from 1862 in particular, very detailed maps, there are all kinds of heat wolves on those maps, including Doc Heatwole, Peggy's uncle, who was probably the brains behind the Underground Railroad. But the heat wolves were so closely associated with the Underground Railroad and other Union sympathizing activities that Jedediah, who was Stonewall Jackson's map maker, when he made a map for the Union Army after the war, he took the heat wolves off. You can look, it's a big detailed map. You can look everywhere on that map. There are no heat wolves on that map. So he wasn't going to acknowledge a heat wolf. And they were very active in this. Anything else?
Was the cemetery where that stone found, was that the Lincoln Cemetery at 10th Legion?
No. The stone wasn't found in a cemetery. The question was Henry's original gravestone found in the Lincoln Cemetery up off of 42? 11. Off of Route 11. No, the answer is no. It was found when someone was repairing and rebuilding his front porch on his mobile home near Fridley's Gap and 10th Legion. And he just literally dug it up and went, "What's this?" So, yeah, it had been there a long time. Any more questions?
What was the missing book is again?
My brother, my oldest brother, has always maintained that he read about these guns being hidden in a cave on the hill behind Weavers Church, and he was reading a book either written about or by Peter Hartman, our great-great-grandfather. This book was in a bookcase in my grandmother's house. And I literally read, when I was a teenager, every book in that bookcase looking for that reference. There is a book in that bookcase that was written about and by Peter Hartman. There's no mention of any cave or guns being hidden in a cave in that book. But my older brother insisted that, no, it was there, and he read it. My grandmother at one point said she thought she loaned that book to someone and it never came back. So I've tried to track it down, no luck yet. There are so many books written about the Civil War here in the Valley that it's really difficult. But I hope it turns up. One more, maybe? One more question? Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Sir.
I have a question about the Mennonites, the pacifists, and all the different underground railroads. Because my family in Ohio was part of that.
Yes.
And is that, you think, true that a lot of the folks that went through it were getting away? I mean, they were the pacifist young men that were trying to escape the war?
The question is it true that the Underground Railroad was used quite a bit for pacifists to escape the war? The answer is yes, but this Underground Railroad that I'm talking about overlaps only slightly with the Underground Railroad for fugitive slaves. So Underground Railroad quite often is talked about in the North. This would have actually been in the South. And I found one instance where this involved helping 3 fugitive slaves, somewhat coincidental help, but the intention was always to help draft dodgers and deserters who were pacifists. Now, toward the end of the war, they were helping all kinds of other people that just wanted to get away from the war. By the time the war had gotten near its conclusion, there was a lot of desertion, and a lot of men were just tired of the war and wanted to go home or wanted to go somewhere to get away from the war. So Peggy, in her testimony, says that after the first year or so, she was helping all these people that she didn't know. So if you can imagine, not only do you have 5 or 6 men at a time hiding underneath your bedroom floor, you don't know them. It's pretty scary.
They probably had very strong faith.
I think they did. I think they did have strong faith.
Was there family history for bedroom, looking at the trap door or whatever it is that went into the hidden cellar?
The question is, can we basically go look at the trap door to the cellar? We know where Peggy's house was, but it was torn down. Pete's going to have to help me with this, but I think it was probably torn down in the late 1800s, probably to use building materials to build a new house nearby. So the original house is no longer there. It's just pasture field. Well, yeah, and then even the house after that was fell victim to a fire. So neither house is still there. There is a place in Doc Heatwell's house where you can see a trapdoor that is underneath a closet. It's in a closet that's underneath the stairs to the second floor. So it's nailed shut now, but you can see the cutout of where that used to be. And you can see the hiding place in the cellar that was only accessible by that trap door. It was not connected in any way to the rest of the cellar. So we do tours of Peggy's War and sites, and that's one of the places we go. And I think there's another place in Criders that I've heard about where you can see a hiding place. An old house near Criders. Criders is in the mountains west of here, not in West Virginia, but almost. Any others? Well, thank you very much for having me.